Well, thank you very much for joining us for another episode of Policy Gone Viral. With me and with JMI today is Justin Pearson, one of the managing partners at the Institute for Justice out of their Miami office. Justin, thank you very much for joining us. And before we jump in, I would just like to get a little bit of information for our viewers on who IJ is and what role you play, because it's certainly one of the most interesting parts of kind of all of this going on.
Yeah, I have one of the greatest jobs in the world. I wake up every day and I sue the government. It's a lot of fun. I highly recommend it. The Institute for Justice, where I work, is the national law firm for liberty. By that, I mean we're our nation's largest libertarian public interest law firm. Now, that's small L libertarian, just philosophically libertarian. We're not affiliated with any parties or candidates. But basically, thanks to our over 8,000 wonderful donors, I spend all of my time, and my colleagues spend their time, traveling around the nation, providing pro bono legal representation to individuals whose constitutional rights have been violated. So it's a great job, and I love it.
Well, and as kind of 2020 unfolds, the importance of public interest law, I think, is going to be even more prevalent. So let's just kind of jump right in. In light of both the pandemic and really kind of segueing into a lot of what we're seeing with the protests that have been happening nationally, there's been a lot of attention being paid to the idea of policing reform. JMI's worked on criminal justice reform, but really it's more kind of concentrated on policing reform. For those of us who haven't had the opportunity to dive into a subject like that, can you explain it or kind of describe it a little bit more for us?
Sure. So policing reform is just one aspect of criminal justice reform. There are other aspects, like, let's say, for, sentencing reform or determining which things should even be crimes. I'm a fan of far fewer crimes, for the record. But those things are different than policing reform, which is more focused on kind of the behavior of police. And of course, we see that at the forefront right now because of what's going on around the nation. And it actually does tie into what we're going to talk about today, which is a civil forfeiture and the equitable sharing loophole, because civil forfeiture is one of, unfortunately, many policies that has the result of making police seem adversarial to the public, where unfortunately in some of our communities today, they view police as an occupying army rather than as a part of the community. And the perverse financial incentives created by civil forfeiture are some of the things that contribute to that unfortunate situation.
Well, when we think about policing, immediately we think about the local law enforcement unit, but really there are interrelated levels of this that go all the way up to the federal government. So before we dive in on civil forfeiture and that, can you extrapolate out that kind of dynamic and what really we're talking about?
Yeah, that's a great point. I hope people are aware of this, but you're probably right. There probably a lot of people aren't, that, there are municipal police, there is county law enforcement, typically sheriffs, there's state law enforcement, and then you have the feds. There's federal law enforcement, like the FBI, for instance.
Yep.
And all four of those levels can arrest you. There are law enforcement agencies at all four of those levels that can arrest you, and unfortunately, there are law enforcement agencies at all four of those levels who can use civil forfeiture against you. And one of the things we're going to be talking about today with the equitable sharing loophole is kind of that interrelationship between federal law enforcement and state and local law enforcement.
Well, kind of, I guess, diving in then to civil forfeiture, just explain to our listeners what it is, kind of any instances where this policy has been abused.
Oh, God, unfortunately, it's been abused quite a bit, but let's start at the beginning. Most people, I even think most, members of the public are at least vaguely aware of criminal forfeiture, which is not civil forfeiture, but it's a good place to start. So criminal forfeiture is when someone is convicted of a crime and the proceeds of the crime or the instrumentalities of the crime get turned over to law enforcement. They might end up at, some sort of auction or something. And most people don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with that. That's not what we're talking about today. Civil forfeiture is when that same thing happens without anyone being convicted of a crime. And that is the vast majority of forfeitures. I think oftentimes people assume, reasonably, but unfortunately incorrectly, that most forfeitures are criminal forfeitures. That's not the case. The overwhelming forfeitures are civil forfeitures where no one's even been arrested or accused of a crime, let alone convicted of anything. And so the way it works is basically law enforcement, if they have reason to believe, or think they have reason to believe, that property or money is suspicious, they get to grab it and keep it for themselves. Now, the fact that they get to keep it for themselves makes them very inclined to view everything suspiciously, especially if you're someone who perhaps doesn't have the means to fight back. And then you have to try to hire a lawyer to get your own money or property back, even though in the overwhelming majority of cases, it would cost more to hire a lawyer than what your property is worth. And by the way, law enforcement knows that. So just to give you a common hypothetical example, right? Someone's driving down the road. They're a member of a community that doesn't trust banks, and those communities exist in our society. They were recently paid. Let's say they were paid, $500 in cash. It's all verifiable. It would all check out. They didn't do anything wrong. They get pulled over for any number of traffic infractions. Police officers will now commonly ask as one of their first questions, do you have any cash on you? Which right away, like, that should be problematic, but that's now standard practice. And so the person honestly says, yes, I have $500 on me. I just got paid. Here's the paperwork. Here's evidence showing that I work in this job. The mere fact that that person has that money on it will, to the police officer, be enough for probable cause for the police officer to take that money, because they view it as suspicious that someone has that money. That person, the day or two later, will call up the police department and say, listen, I'll give you whatever evidence you need. I've never been arrested in my life. You didn't even arrest me yesterday when you took my money. What do I need to do to prove to you that, like, this money is not naughty money? Like, this is legitimate money. And what they'll tell them, and this is what they'll actually say, they'll say, well, listen, you might be right. And it's possible that, this is totally legitimate. And it's possible that if you fought us in court, eventually you'd get your $500 back. But to do that, you'd have to pay a lawyer $10,000. So why don't we do this? Why don't you let us keep part and you keep part, and we go our separate ways? And just for the different financial reasons I just said in terms of the cost involved, people take the deal. And it's heartbreaking. It destroys their faith in our legal system. I can tell you, many people who have called me up who have never been arrested in their lives and don't understand why their money was stolen by the police, they will never trust our legal system again. It's not the way things are supposed to work. But that is the most common type of forfeiture in the United States today. And it's called civil forfeiture.
So, but Florida reformed this a few years ago. So do we have anything to be concerned about at this point?
Well, so Florida reformed its state law. And this is what really goes back to what Sal was asking before with the different levels of law enforcement. So Florida did a very good job of reforming its state law in 2016. I should add, where I worked, the Institute for Justice was involved. The James Madison Institute was involved. Sal and I would often sit next to each other at the legislative committee meetings. And so well done, JMI, well done, IJ, if I may say so myself, and numerous other groups, and getting some really meaningful reform passed in 2016. And I should also point out, we're seeing this reform around the country, where states are realizing that, first, in some states, they're realizing that civil forfeiture shouldn't exist, and 3 states no longer have it at all. But other states are doing things more along the lines of what Florida did, where they're raising the burden. So now the burden in civil forfeiture in Florida is beyond a reasonable doubt. It's basically the criminal burden, but in civil court. Also, a big fix was Florida raised how much money police have to pay when they file a civil forfeiture action. Between the non-refundable fee and the bond that goes to the prevailing party that they have to pay up front, that's $2,500 law enforcement has to pay when they file a forfeiture action, which now takes away the profit incentive for any forfeiture of less than $2,500, which is where we were seeing a lot of the abuse. There are also restrictions now on when police can seize the property. And so seizure is when they first take in the property. Forfeiture is about who gets to own the property. And so they're just wonderful, wonderful reforms, but they were state level reforms. And now we're seeing in Florida, when unfortunately we're seeing in a lot of other states that only pass state level reforms, equitable sharing, the so-called equitable sharing loophole is being used to pay state and local police to circumvent state law.
Can you give a little bit of a background on what the equitable sharing loophole is and how it kind of re-implements the program at the local level just by a different name?
Yeah, so here's how equitable sharing works. Obviously, this is going to be a bit of an oversimplification, but this is the gist of it, and it's disturbing. Basically, what happens is the feds will tell state and local police, especially after a good state law reform, like Florida's 2016 reform that JMI and IJ helped pass. The feds will tell state and local police, don't change a thing, ignore the reform, do everything the way you did before, but at the last second, hand it off to us. And this is called adoption. the federal law enforcement agencies will adopt the seizure and then file the forfeiture lawsuit in federal court under federal law instead of state court. And in federal court, none of those state law protections or reforms will apply. It'll still be based on something called CAFRA, which was a very modest reform passed in 2000 for federal law, the Civil Asset Forfeiture Reform Act. It's nowhere near as strong as any of these state law reforms we're seeing. And so the feds will say, give us the forfeiture, give us everything you seized, give us all the evidence, do everything the same way. We'll file it in federal court to avoid all of these property rights protections. And in exchange, you let us keep 20% and we'll kick you back 80% for letting us take over this forfeiture. And it's that 80% kickback that's what's called equitable sharing.
So then just looking forward, the path forward for this policy, what is that at both the federal and then continuing at the state level?
Yeah, so obviously, ideally, there would be federal reform, and there are efforts to reform federal law. But I think one thing that's really fascinating is 7 states plus the District of Columbia, so 8 places in our country, have found a way on their end to close the equitable sharing loophole. And so what they do is they say that if you get involved with equitable sharing, if you do what I just described, Mr. County Sheriff, for example, you can still do everything you did before, but at the end, instead of you keeping the money, it goes into the general fund. And so what that means is that law enforcement is not limited at all, but it takes away the perverse incentive. It ensures that they're doing whatever they're doing for the right reasons and not because they want to keep the money themselves. And in those 7 states plus DC, we've seen that this has really helped a lot.
Is this something that Florida can or should kind of pursue in policy? Is there anything prohibiting that?
Absolutely. I mean, frankly, civil forfeiture shouldn't exist, right? And so as good as the 2016 reforms were, I would have liked them to go even further. But nonetheless, they were great reforms. And those reforms should not be undercut by this equitable sharing loophole. And just on top of the policy issues, if I were a state legislator, I would be insulted, right? Because what you have now is you have the federal government paying state and local police to thumb their noses at the state legislature, right? State and local police should follow state law. They shouldn't be getting paid by the federal government to circumvent state law, but that's what equitable sharing is. Yeah, it's infuriating.
Well, I know that, this is a kind of a very dense topic. It's something that not, as we had spoken about, not a lot of people were even aware that this existed. Where can they find some more information, either on IJ's site or nationally or in their state?
So IJ.org, the Institute for Justice, we usually go by the initials IJ. Our site is IJ.org. It has a ton of wonderful information on there. We've had studies. We're extremely well known for our policing for profit study that talks about this issue. We have an incredible strategic research team. We're not just lawyers. We have a bunch of other wonderful people who do incredible work. And so there's a ton of information on there that I would direct you to. But let me just leave you with one stat that struck me in case someone doesn't come across it. So our wonderful strategic research team looked at the rate of equitable sharing. And rate's important. I'm not talking about the cumulative amount. It doesn't matter how populous your state is. We're talking about how often per case equitable sharing is used. Florida was the 4th most, the 4th highest rate. And it's not a surprise when you think about the 2016 reforms, right? There does seem to be this correlation between good state law reforms and increased equitable sharing. And it's for the reason I said that you have the federal government going to state and local police in the states where good reforms were passed and saying, ignore the reforms, we found a workaround. It's not the way things are supposed to work.
Well, Justin, thank you for all that you're doing, all that IJ does. We really appreciate the time that you've taken out to come and speak with us on Policy Gone Viral. Look forward to seeing you in the Capitol and in DC. Follow your adventures in the Supreme Court as well. Keep up the great work.
Thank you. And right back at you. As you know, I'm a big fan of JMI's work, and it's an honor to be on your show.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, guys.
Is my head cut off here or what?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. You do have like a partial animal skeleton coming out of the side of your head, but it's fine.
That's cool, man. Oh, you got a couple of them.
Yeah. They're not real.
Oh, no, well.
Yeah.